The announcement lasted less than a minute, but its meaning struck at the heart of the monarchy. Prince Alexander stood beside Princess Eleanor as the room fell silent, and he delivered 8 words no one inside Ashcombe the Castle expected to hear. "We are leaving Ashcombe forever." There was no clarification, no softening statement, and no promise of return. As the silence settled over the room, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a temporary retreat. It was a final break. He had summoned the senior household staff to a private reception room, a formal space normally reserved for confidential family and administrative meetings. Elena stood beside him with her hands clasped, fighting to hold her expression steady as the room watched. The prince then made the decision unmistakably clear. He, his wife, Prince Julian, Princess Sophia, and Prince Oliver were leaving Ashcombe permanently, and the estate would never again serve as their family home. Eleanor lowered her eyes when she heard the word forever. She understood why the choice had become necessary, yet the pain remained. Ashcombe had been more than a royal address. It had been the place where the family rebuilt its private life, protected the children from pressure, and found stability during uncertain times. Now that refuge had become tied to betrayal. King Edmund received the warning by telephone only moments before the household heard it. The king gripped the arm of his chair and asked whether there was still time to reconsider. Alexander did not soften his reply. He explained that public criticism had not forced the move, that health concerns had not caused it, and that security problems were not responsible. Trust had been broken from inside Ashcombe itself. Alexander then referred to a sealed internal file, a confidential palace record, circulated only to authorised officials. The document showed that private information about Elena and the children had travelled beyond those permitted to receive it. Names had been withheld, but the pattern was deliberate. Someone had turned family knowledge into leverage. The room remained frozen as the future king reached into his pocket. He removed his Ashcombe access card, placed it on the table, and looked at the secretary. "This will not be needed again," he said. Edmund already understood which confrontation had pushed his son beyond retreat. The identity remained unspoken, but the silence around it carried its own accusation. To understand why Alexander was prepared to abandon Ashcombe forever, the story must first turn to the people who stood to lose far more than a royal residence. For the public, Ashcombe represented continuity, ceremony, and royal permanence. For Alexander and Eleanor, it had become something far more personal, a refuge built around their children during the most difficult years of their lives. Leaving meant surrendering familiar rooms, routines, and memories. Staying, however, meant accepting that someone within the royal circle could no longer be trusted. The decision was therefore not about property. It was about whether a future king could still protect his own family. Alexander had once believed Ashcombe offered the perfect balance. Julian, Sophia, and Oliver could grow up with greater privacy while remaining close to royal duty, and the legacy of the late Queen, the values, responsibilities, and traditions Queen Margaret had left behind for the next generation. The prince wanted his children to understand service without allowing palace pressure to consume their childhood. Eleanor had needed that protection just as deeply. During periods of intense strain, the residents had given her space to recover, remain close to the children, and hold the family together, away from constant public attention. Ashcombe had become the place where she could breathe. Now, every familiar room carried a new question. Who had listened, who had spoken, and who had decided that her private life could be used for power? Julian understood more than his parents wanted him to. He knew that leaving a major royal residence carried constitutional meaning, because he was not simply a child moving house. He was the future heir, leaving a place closely tied to the crown. Alexander tried to call it a family decision, but his eldest son heard the weight behind every careful word. Sophia responded with anger. She looked directly at Eleanor and asked why they had to leave when they were not the ones who had broken anyone's trust. Her mother struggled to answer because the question cut through every palace explanation. The innocent were being moved while the person responsible remained inside. Oliver resisted in a quieter way. He sat beside a half-packed box holding a small framed family photograph and refused to place it inside. He insisted it belonged in his room at Ashcombe. Elena knelt beside him, but the youngest child held the frame tighter, as though refusing to pack it could somehow stop the decision from becoming real. Alexander later spoke to his wife alone. He revealed, through a confidential internal briefing, that the leaked information could only have come from a restricted conversation attended by 4 senior figures. Elena's expression changed when he repeated the words that had escaped. Details about her future royal role had appeared almost exactly as she had heard them inside the room. Edmund walked alone after speaking to his son. The king carried a guilt he could no longer dismiss, because Alexander had warned him before. He had called the tension manageable. He had believed time would soften it. Time had done the opposite. The departure did not begin with the announcement. It began during one carefully controlled ceremony, when a forbidden demand crossed the line between royal ambition and family betrayal. Every royal crisis has one moment that later appears inevitable. In this case, it came during a private family meeting inside Ashcombe, away from cameras and public scrutiny. What should have been a quiet discussion about future responsibilities became a struggle over Eleanor's position, Julian's preparation, and Queen Consort Isabel's authority. A single request was made. A private refusal followed. Then words intended to remain inside the room reached outsiders within hours. From that moment, Alexander knew the danger was no longer outside the gates. Alexander entered the succession briefing expecting a controlled discussion. A succession briefing was a restricted meeting used to plan future royal duties, responsibilities, and preparation for the next generation. Eleanor sat beside him while Edmund and Isabel faced them across the table. 2 constitutional advisors remained present, because every decision involving the heir and his family could shape the monarchy's future. Isabel spoke first. She argued that Eleanor's ceremonial schedule should require her approval, and insisted that no separate royal household could operate independently while Edmund remained monarch. The Queen Consort framed the demand as unity, but Alexander heard something else. He heard an attempt to control his wife, limit his household, and reach into the preparation of Julian. Alexander refused without hesitation. He told her that Eleanor's role would not be placed under personal supervision, and that decisions involving the children would remain with their parents. The prince kept his voice low, yet every word carried finality. He had tolerated interference before. This time, he would not. Isabel pushed her chair back and placed both hands on the table. She told Alexander that living at Ashcombe did not give his household the right to behave like a separate court, a phrase meaning a rival centre of influence operating beside the monarch's official household. The phrase changed the room. Edmund looked toward his son, but the king said nothing. Elena ended the argument with a quieter warning. She said Julian, Sophia, and Oliver would not become leverage in a struggle over rank, access, or future power. The princess spoke calmly, but her message was unmistakable. Her children were not bargaining tools. 3 hours later, the silence shattered. Alexander's office received a private media inquiry containing language lifted directly from the sealed briefing. The message repeated the exact phrase, separate court, and asked whether Elena was preparing an independent royal structure around Julian. The future king read it twice before passing it to his wife. She did not need an explanation. The wording proved the leak was deliberate. Edmund studied the same inquiry in silence. The monarch knew that only those inside the room, or aides briefed immediately afterward, could have released it. His hesitation now carried a cost. Alexander requested a private meeting with Isabel at once. The next conversation would not be protected by advisors' protocol or carefully prepared statements. Only a locked door and 2 people who no longer trusted each other. Alexander entered the meeting carrying no folder, no prepared statement, and no intention of negotiating. Isabel was already waiting, composed but defensive, aware that the leak had transformed a family disagreement into a crisis of trust. There were no aides in the room and no witnesses to soften what followed. The future king asked one direct question. Had she authorised anyone to discuss the Ashcombe briefing? Her answer did not calm him. It convinced him the breach went deeper than one conversation. Alexander had ordered both households to treat the meeting as completely confidential, a royal household being the private team of staff and advisors serving a senior member of the family. He began by explaining that the leaked wording had exposed more than a disagreement. It had revealed private details about Elena's duties and Julian's future preparation, placing his wife and son inside a struggle they had never chosen. Isabel denied speaking directly to the media. Then she admitted something more damaging. She had discussed the briefing with her senior private secretary, because she believed Alexander's refusal threatened royal unity. The Queen Consort insisted she had only sought advice, but the prince heard the truth beneath the excuse. Restricted family information had been passed forward after he had clearly refused her demand. Alexander told her that betrayal did not begin with a journalist. It began the moment she shared private details with someone who had no right to use them. He said the leak had turned Elena's future role into a weapon and dragged Julian's name into a conflict over influence. Isabel answered that she had been protecting the crown. The words broke his restraint. Alexander rose from his chair and looked directly at her. "You were protecting control," he said. The future king then moved toward the closed door, but Isabel stopped him with one final revelation. Through that recorded private conversation, She admitted that Edmund had known she intended to seek advice about his resistance. The king had not approved any disclosure, yet he had not forbidden the discussion either. Alexander understood what that silence meant. His father had once again avoided confronting the tension between his wife and his heir. Edmund had chosen delay, hoping the conflict would fade. Instead, that hesitation had allowed private rivalry to reach Eleanor and the children. Isabel's composure finally cracked when the prince said his wife no longer felt safe raising their family at Ashcombe. He told her that a home stopped being secure once private conversations could be turned into pressure. Alexander opened the door and delivered his final warning. The matter would now be decided by the one person with authority over Ashcombe, King Edmund. The confrontation had exposed the betrayal, but the final power still rested, with a father forced to choose between protecting his wife's position and preserving his son's trust. The monarchy suddenly depended on a decision Edmund had avoided for years. As king, he possessed authority over the royal households, access arrangements, and internal discipline. As a husband, he understood Isabel's fear of being pushed aside by the rising influence of Alexander and Elena. As a father, however, he faced the unbearable possibility that his own silence had driven his eldest son away. When Alexander entered the room, Edmund was not confronting an institutional problem. He was confronting the consequences of his own hesitation. Edmund knew exactly what he could do. The king could reorganise household access, remove senior aides, limit confidential briefings, and give Alexander's family greater independence inside Ashcombe. A written assurance meant a formal promise backed by royal authority, not a private understanding that could later be ignored. The monarch had the power to end the crisis. What he lacked was the courage to choose whom that decision would hurt. Alexander asked for no new title, no public punishment, and no control over the castle. The prince placed one condition before his father. Isabel's office must have no authority over Eleanor or the children. He wanted a clear boundary protecting their schedules, private information, and preparation for future duties, nothing more. Yet Edmund understood that signing it would weaken his wife's influence and confirm that his heir no longer trusted the household he had built. Alexander spoke without anger at first. He told the king that every delay had forced Elena to carry pressure she had never created. He said Julian, Sophia, and Oliver now felt watched inside the place meant to protect them. The future king did not raise his voice. That restraint made the accusation harder to escape. Edmund reached for the pen. The monarch held it above the assurance while Alexander watched in silence. Seconds passed. Then the king slowly placed it back on the table without signing. The prince looked at his father's hand and understood the answer before a single word followed. Edmund offered a compromise. Isabel's senior secretary would be removed from sensitive briefings, but her general authority as queen would remain untouched. The king described it as balance. Alexander called it avoidance. He said one aide had not created the betrayal. A culture had created it. A culture in which family boundaries could be discussed, tested, and traded whenever power was at stake. Edmund then asked whether leaving Ashcombe would dishonour the memory of Queen Margaret. Alexander's expression hardened. He answered that using her legacy to demand silence would dishonour her far more than any departure ever could. The prince gave his father until midnight to sign. Midnight passed without a signature, and by sunrise the decision had moved beyond family argument into irreversible action. At sunrise, the consequences became physical. Security schedules were rewritten. Staff assignments were suspended, and private belongings began disappearing from rooms that had seemed permanent only the day before. No announcement had yet reached the public, but Ashcombe already felt the rupture. Elena moved through the family quarters with quiet concentration, while Alexander issued short instructions and avoided unnecessary conversation. The decision was no longer a warning designed to force change. The family was actually preparing to leave. Alexander directed his private secretary to begin transferring the family's primary residence, security command, schooling arrangements, and official working base away from Ashcombe. A security command was the team responsible for coordinating protection, travel, and access around the family. Only essential staff were informed, but the speed of the operation destroyed any hope that this was temporary. The prince was not creating distance, he was ending an era. Elena entered Sophia's room and stopped. Her daughter was carefully removing photographs from the wall without asking for help. The princess tried to speak, but Sophia continued working in silence. That quiet resistance hurt more than anger. She understood that the child was trying to control the only part of the loss she could touch. Julian carried the pain differently. He remained composed until he was alone with his father, then asked whether leaving meant they had lost against the people who wanted them gone. Alexander immediately knelt beside his son. Leaving a place that no longer protects your family is not defeat, he said. Staying silent would have been. Julian listened, but the sadness in his face did not disappear. Senior officers soon discovered that a new base had already been prepared. Secure rooms had been checked, protection routes approved, and private working areas quietly arranged weeks earlier. The finding proved that Alexander had considered departure before the final confrontation. He had hoped never to use the plan, yet he had refused to leave his family without an escape. Eleanor had authorised those early preparations after the succession briefing. Through a confidential instruction recorded by her private office, she had approved basic arrangements because she feared Edmund would once again avoid drawing a firm boundary. The princess had not expected the worst, she had simply prepared for it. Isabel saw the removal boxes moving through a restricted corridor and froze. The Queen Consort finally understood that Alexander's warning had never been an empty threat. He was leaving, and no palace statement could disguise it. Elena then found her husband and asked for one final private conversation before the decision became public. Before the world learned that the family was leaving, husband and wife faced a question that neither palace protocol nor royal duty could answer for them. For the first time since the crisis began, there were no advisors, no constitutional papers, and no competing royal voices. Alexander and Elena sat alone in the family quarters, while the house around them was being packed away. The argument was over. The decision had been made. Yet one question remained. Were they leaving because they had been driven out, or because they had finally chosen the kind of family they intended to become? Elena's answer transformed the departure into an act of strength. She asked everyone to leave the room. No aide, security officer, or household official would hear what passed between them. She reminded Alexander that Ashcombe had once given their family stability, privacy, and room to heal. But a sanctuary, a place meant to offer safety and peace, could not remain sacred once the trust inside it had been destroyed. Alexander finally admitted what he had kept hidden beneath his anger. He feared he had failed Queen Margaret's legacy. The prince worried that history would remember him as the heir who abandoned Ashcombe during his father's reign, not as a man protecting his family. The late queen had represented duty to him, and leaving felt dangerously close to betrayal. Elena refused to let guilt decide their future. She told him that Julian, Sophia, and Oliver would not remember newspaper approval or palace arguments about tradition. They would remember whether their father protected them when staying silent would have been easier. The princess understood the cost of leaving, but she also understood the greater cost of teaching their children that duty required them to accept fear. Elena slowly removed her wedding ring and placed it in Alexander's palm. She told him their deepest promise had been made to each other before it had ever been made to a residence, a household, or an institution. The gesture broke through his restraint. For the first time since the leak, the future king stopped speaking like an heir and allowed himself to feel like a husband. Alexander then revealed his final plan through a statement prepared with his private office.